We thought we'd do a video today about the bumblebee, as there are so many in our garden, and we've actually got 2 bumblebee nests, so we're going to look at those today. And I just thought I'd give you a little bit of background to the bumblebee and the history of the bumblebee. And it wasn't until the mid 1800s little was known about bumblebees, and the life history or anything had yet to be described. And Charles Darwin was one of the first people to actually work on the bumblebee and try and understand its life cycle. And the bumblebee year begins with the emergence of the first brave queens from hibernation in spring, often as early as February and March. And I expect you may have seen the very large bumblebees around in February and March time. These queens are the biggest of their kind, and since only the fattest survive hibernation, the first to emerge are sort of zeppelins of the insect world. What happens then is that the bumblebee comes out, and the first thing they do, they drone slowly through the cold air, labouring to find things like spring flowers. Pussy willow is one example of a plant that they'll fly and find, and they're so heavy that flowers droop under the weight of their enormous bodies. And then only the female trees produce super rich nectar, and it's that nectar that the queens first need to boost their energy levels, because they've been sleeping for such a long time. And then over the next few weeks the queens will slowly fatten, and as their eggs begin to develop they start to search for a nest site. Many species like to look underground, but as you'll see in the garden today, their nest, or 2 of their nests, are both in bird boxes. And these particular bumblebees, we have buff-tailed bumblebees, they do tend to look for either under stones or bird boxes. Often they remain underground for many minutes, exploring though, if they do go down, to have a look and see what they can find. It's usually rodent tunnels or moles or rabbit tunnels to sleep in. They don't gather nest material either. They tend to have to find somewhere that's got nest material already, and this is why in our case we've got these 2 bird boxes. They were bird boxes for blue tits and grey tits last year, and as a consequence of that they left behind all their nesting material, and that's absolutely perfect for the bumblebee. And what the bumblebee does, they'll enthusiastically arrange or rearrange the materials that they find in and around the nest into a cosy ball with a hollow centre. Some bumblebees, known as carder bees, will even vigorously comb it with bristles on their legs. Another place that they could stay is loft insulation, which is ideal for them as well, or even air bricks. So whatever site the bee will choose, within it the queen bee constructs a loose ball of insulating material with a central cavity and a hole through which she can squeeze. And within this cavity, it could be the size of a tennis ball, she constructs a thimble-shaped cup from wax produced from special glands on the underside of her body, which is then scraped off and moulded into shape with her legs. And she fills this cup with honey. She also collects pollen during those period of time between February and March. She's on her own really at this point, because the honeybees have not actually come out yet, it's too cold for them. Then the pollen she'll store as well. It's just like the size of a pea drop in inside the honey itself, and then she'll even coat that with wax. So by the time her ovaries have fully developed, she's ready to lay eggs, and she'll only actually lay 16 eggs because she's only got 8 pairs of ovaries, again unlike the honeybee, which can lay, for England really, laying 1,000 to 2,000 eggs a day. And the sperm she's got from last year, so she keeps that throughout the time that she's in hibernation. So once she's laid the eggs, she buries them inside the pollen, and then she incubates the eggs, and she has to keep the nest at about 30 degrees, so she shivers to keep warm, or to keep the eggs warm. That takes a lot of energy, and of course she has been hibernating for such a long time, and it's all a matter of luck. This is the most dangerous period for the bumblebee, that they keep going until these first brood hatches, because she's completely on her own, and she does actually have to pop out every so often to get food just to keep herself going. But all being well, if it all works out for her, they'll hatch in 4 days into tiny grubs, and those grubs will then tuck in and feed, and they will feed like mad on whatever's in the hive. And again, she still has to pop out and get food for herself to keep herself going. So eventually they'll become an adult bee after shedding skin about 3 or 4 times, and then all the first bees that come out will be females, and they'll all be daughters of the queen, and they are all her workers. And when they first emerge, they're entirely white, resembling a little imagination, rather like a polar bear really. As soon as her first batch of larvae has pupated, however, the queen will have laid a second batch of eggs, and by now these should be well developed grubs. The workers then, they are initially tentative when they leave the nest, but their first flights are short as they familiarise themselves, just like the honeybee does, with the entrance to the nest and the surrounding areas as landmarks. And after a few exploratory trips, they range a bit further and experiment about visiting flowers. They have innate preferences for blues and yellows, unlike the honeybee, but they hone in more on blue and yellow plants, finding nectar and pollen. Once they've, however, found food, they begin rapidly to the nest, and they bring that food back for the queen. So then at that point, the queen in her nest is now being fed, and she won't actually leave the nest now until the end of the season, when she will actually die. But she'll keep laying eggs right through until about July time, and then once she gets to July time, she has a change of plan, and she changes the pheromone. And what she does then, instead of just laying female workers that have been working for her, she actually lays male as well as female, and they both then hatch out together, and this is about July and August, and the virgin queens are then accosted by the males, obviously, and they become impregnated with sperm, but just one male will fertilise the virgin queen. So as soon as that queen is mated, she'll find somewhere to hibernate. Now that can be as early as July or August, and she will then hibernate from then right through until February. So she has to quickly go and find as much food as she possibly can to keep her going for at least 5 months. So back in the old nest though, the founding queen is now a little over a year old, and she's frail and she's balding. She's got her workforce no longer being there because they've all gone. All the reserves of the colony have gone, and as the ageing workers die off, the food supply dries up really, and then all the bees die. And by September, all that remains, because she then dies, are the pungent smell and a pile of empty pupal cells, possibly honey pots and bee corpses, which are slowly picked through and eaten by a range of scavengers. Then the new queens of the aptly named early bumblebee enter hibernation and stay there until February. And then of course the cycle happens all over again. The blue tits come along in the spring, they find the nest boxes just like you see today. They'll go and have a look inside, they'll see some nesting material, but they then will spend all their time cleaning it out and starting and setting it up all again. And we've had this now in the garden for 3 or 4 years, where the blue tits taken over the nest one year and the bumblebees have taken over the nest on the other.